I'm the executive manager of the Heidelberg Center for the Environment at Heidelberg University, our interdisciplinary research center that brings together everyone that wants to do research on environmental issues, and we foster new research projects in that field. And my role is to bridge the gap between knowledge and action, to help create better knowledge about climate action and needs, and also to guide the way towards action. And today at this COP, my role is a bit of a good COP and a bad COP at the same time, because I will have to give you some insights on the current role funding and financing plays in climate, especially when it comes to health, and what's going well and the good developments, but also what's not going well. And a short disclaimer: a lot of the statistics that I will bring will differ to a great extent, because they depend on different projections of the future, different scenarios, and depending on which source you look at, the funding needs can differ quite greatly. So that's why there will be some differences in the numbers. If we look at the current trends in climate finance, and that's one of the good news in the beginning, at least, the money that is provided for climate finance is growing. But when we're talking about climate finance, we mean very different things. We're talking about mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage at the same time. And a lot of the climate finance that has been provided in recent years actually comes from the private sector. And a lot of it is invested in mitigation, which is great, addressing the root causes of climate change, a lot of investment in renewable energy, for example. But when we look at the adaptation needs, especially when we connect this with the presentations that we just heard about the impact climate change has on our health, the burden of disease, there are huge funding gaps to finance adaptation, sustainable adaptation, and in particular also dealing with the loss and damage climate change is already causing. If we look at the right graph here, then you see that in 2023, there was around 46 billion US dollars provided to provide funding for adaptation. And there was a need, or there's a projected need of 222 billion of average annual needs between 2024 and 2030. And the further you go in the future, the further the funding requirements will grow. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty connected to this, because we don't exactly know how we will continue with mitigation, and the less we mitigate, the more we will have to adapt. And that will also mean that more funding is required. If we take a look at Africa, we've spoken about different regions in Africa. There will be speakers from Burkina Faso, for example, after me. Then we see that there are different funding requirements according to this report by the Climate Policy Initiative, depending on which region in Africa we're looking at, but also different amounts of funding provided. We see that there are huge needs, especially in Eastern Africa and Western Africa, and that's also where more of the funding went through, but there's also where there are more needs. Overall, we just see that it's chronically underfunded, especially when it comes to adaptation in lots of sub-Saharan African states. And if you followed a bit the debate on climate finance over the past few COPs, you may have followed the pledges, what states, especially in the global north, are pledging to provide in terms of funding for states in the global south that have to deal with loss and damage and that have to adapt. And this has changed. The targets have changed dramatically in recent years. And last year there was this new pledge of the 300 billion US dollars that should be provided by 2035. There was a lot of debate on this, a lot of back and forth. But when we compare this to the targets that we had in the past, that is a huge increase, of course. but we will look at the actual requirements in a second, and we'll see that a lot needs to happen there. And then another challenge is that there are lots of different funds out there. If you look at the COP mandated funds in themselves, there we have the Global Environment Facility, we have the Adaptation Fund, we have the Green Climate Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund that is currently managed by the World Bank. So a lot of different institutions and a lot of requirements to submit funding requests there, a lot of bureaucracy that states and private actors have to go through. And this is one of the challenges, especially states in the Global South are facing, is how to access these funds. And it's often very intransparent for them to understand how do you get the money if you want to invest, if you have to adapt. And if we now take a look at the funding requirements of what has been pledged by governments, it's the 300 billion at the last COPs. And then by the private sector, we actually see greater investment, especially in mitigation, because there you also have a clearer return of invest of around 800 billion US dollars. But the actual needs beyond China, so China was taken out of this equation because China isn't investing a lot itself. It is estimated that there is a requirement of 2.4 trillion US dollars. And if you compare that with what is provided until or beyond 2030, the projections often go until 2035. We have a massive gap, and I think this is something that should also be discussed again at this COP. Why is it then difficult if there is funding available? Well, often there is limited institutional capacity, limited experience, technical knowledge that you need to write proposals to get money from the grants. But there's also a higher investment risks, especially for private sector actors that want a lot of security. And in mitigation, investing in renewable energy, the business models are getting more and more attractive also for the private sector. But when it comes to financing damage, or when it comes to like dealing with the damage or adaptation, it's not so clear what you might get back in terms of pure monetary flows. And then, of course, there is also a lack of data and transparency. We also heard it in Reiner's presentation earlier. We need much better indicators, much more knowledge on the actual developments, on the health risks, and how this can be translated into financing as well. And then we also sometimes have weak policy and regulatory frameworks that could enable more effective funding streams. But I don't want to end with the challenges. I also want to talk about some of the opportunities that we are addressing here today. They are, for example, academia can work together with the public sector and the private sector in transdisciplinary projects, for example, to contribute to better data and transparency, to also co-create knowledge and to provide tailored knowledge of what data is actually needed. And I think we will also hear more about this from Sandra later today, which role science can play to provide the data and knowledge that is needed to then also access funding streams. Then we need stronger policies and regulatory frameworks, and this ideally would be evidence-based, that we look at where funding is needed, where loss and damage is occurring, and then also creating policies that are evidence-based and not anecdotal. And building institutional capacity. This is also a topic of green skills, of sustainability literacy. We need better understanding, better skills in all different sectors where people understand how to communicate, how to assess, and how to manage climate change and health in all different sectors.